Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Looking Ahead and What's Next for Campus Climate Leadership. We're delighted to have you with us today for the first session in our webinar series exploring the future of higher education's role in climate action. This series is a collaboration between the American Council on Education and Second Nature, uniting our shared commitments to strengthening institutional leadership, advancing climate resilience, and supporting the public purposes of higher education. My name is Marisol Morales, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Carnegie Elective Classifications and Assistant Vice President at ACE. And I'm honored to help open this series with our partner, Second Nature. Before we begin, I'm pleased to note that today's panel will be moderated by Tim Carter, the president of Second Nature, whose leadership has been instrumental in helping shape national conversations on climate action and sustainability. Today's session is designed to frame the landscape ahead. We'll start by exploring current policy environment and shifting federal priorities that are impacting higher education's role in climate action. We'll reflect on the unique positions of colleges and universities as stable, innovative actors in moments of political volatility. And we'll also look at the intersections of policy, science, philanthropy, and leadership that will shape campus sustainability in 2026 and beyond. As the opening session, this conversation also sets the tone for the full series, grounding us in both the realities of the moment and the possibilities of collective action. Throughout the hour, we'll explore themes essential to campus climate leadership, engagement with federal policy and sustained advocacy, whole of institution approaches that leverage research, teaching, community partnerships, and student leadership, and involving trends in climate funding and philanthropy, including catalytic investments, blended finance, and community-centered strategies. Thanks again for joining us, and we're thrilled to launch this ACE Second Nature series in partnership with all of you, leaders, scholars, practitioners, and advocates shaping the future of climate leadership in higher education. I want to let folks know that you all can use the Q&A for questions and then the chat for engagement. At this time, we'll get started, and I'll turn it over to Tim Carter. Tim?
Thanks, Marisol. It's great to be with you. And thanks to ACE for being such great partners, not only on this webinar, but for the past few years. We've worked on a lot of climate sustainability topics together. I know this is our mission. Second Nature has a mission to accelerate climate action in and through higher education. ACE's mission is much broader than that. So I've appreciated the whole members of the ACE team and the leadership there for really leaning into the importance of this critical topic that faces society. So thanks and kudos to everyone on the team for helping us with this webinar. I just got back from Belém, Brazil, where COP30 is taking place, and we were able to represent a little bit of the higher education global community there. What was interesting is that despite what people were hearing in the international community out of Washington, they were able to see that U.S. climate leadership really is real. It's just not taking place at the federal government level, but that there are subnational governments such as cities and states who are represented there, and subnational sectors like higher education who are really committed to addressing climate change. One of the important things that I walked away with was that while many of our colleagues were expressing real concern over the state of U.S. higher education, they didn't really appreciate the fact that there was still a lot of activity happening. Their perception was that a lot of this was getting shut down. And in fact, they were really encouraged by the vibrant presence that not only U.S. higher education had, but U.S. subnationals had in general. So that was pretty encouraging. This panel is really about understanding the challenges and opportunities facing our sector and the sector's climate action moving forward. I wanted to mention one recent study that we completed in partnership with Ohio State University. We surveyed thousands of people about their perception of higher education's role in addressing climate change. And we had done this actually when Biden first came into office 4 years ago. And so this is the second time we did this study. And this time, one of the key findings was that trust in higher education is very, very important. For those who responded that they had high levels of trust in higher education, 80% of those people thought it was very important that the sector was addressing climate change. For those people who said they had low trust in higher education, only 54% of them thought it was very important that higher education was tackling climate change. So it's not fully, right on the surface apparent that trust in higher education or in our institutions is the one of the key foundations for how we can move forward. But that survey really illustrated that. And I think one of the important things as we move forward into the discussion today is that the people we have speaking on this panel are going to address and think about some of these fundamental structural pieces of higher education and philanthropy based on where their positions are. So we're really honored to have three great panelists. Londe Jose is the managing director of the Waverly Street Foundation, and she's going to give us some perspective from a climate funder. What is she hearing and experiencing as we move into this era of climate action writ large? And then specifically, she has some background with higher education, which she can describe more. Greg Washington is the president of George Mason University, and President Washington has been front and center in thinking about how George Mason can be a real leader in all forms of action, including climate action. And I know from his presidential role, he's seen a lot of different opportunities and challenges, obviously, in what action and leadership look like moving forward. So we're really honored to have that perspective. And then Bob Kopp is a distinguished professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Rutgers University and has done a lot of the foundational academic work, especially in recent years, thinking about what are some pieces of the university's infrastructure, particularly here in the US, but even globally, that could be mobilized maybe in different ways and more effective ways, in ways that we haven't even thought about towards addressing this key challenge of climate change. So how we're going to do this is that each of these panelists is going to give about 5 minutes of an overview, talking about where they see the challenges and opportunities from their perspective. And then we're going to walk through a series of questions. Like Marisol said, I would encourage everyone to add your questions in the chat as you have them, or in the Q&A as you have them. And we'll have a little bit of time after we have a group discussion to address those questions at the end. But I wanted to start with Londe, who can give us a little bit of perspective on climate philanthropy in this current moment. Londe, over to you.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to everyone for the invitation today. I come to this work both as a funder in climate, but having spent a few years as the higher education policy advisor to the governor of California. And so as I think about the climate challenges that we have, I think about it very much from a policy perspective. And one of the key things that as a foundation we're responding to is the fact that unlike when I started at this job 3 or 4 years ago, overshoot is a reality now, that we are not really considering the idea of containing global warming to 1.5 degrees, that's highly unlikely. And that, of course, has been combined with the fact that we've had kind of a retrenchment at the federal level in terms of support for climate change. There had been a fair amount of progress, as you all know, during the Biden administration in terms of the bipartisan infrastructure law, in terms of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, both of which were really keenly focused on reducing carbon emissions in every sector and across numerous communities in the United States. Instead, we are now in a moment where we're seeing a resurgence in fossil fuel industries. And to Tim's earlier point, not only are we seeing that shift in the broader environment, but climate change and the climate change advocates have lost the narrative around climate change and the attention economy. And so we aren't, people are assuming both in climate change generally as well as in higher education that nothing is happening, that we're making no progress. And I think one of the things that's incumbent upon us all to do is to demonstrate where there are both possibilities for action and where progress is being made. Tim mentioned that right now the Conference of Parties, COP30, is taking place in Belém, Brazil, where there's a lot of focus on assessing progress against the Paris agreements of 10 years ago. And there are subnationals there, both states. Gavin Newsom has had a great deal of purchase, as well as, subnational organizations and fields and industries and sectors. And but that it's not clear what can happen here in the United States. And that is all happening as we have some good things happening too. We are witnessing really what I think of as being the clean energy generation in wind, in solar, in batteries, in entrepreneurial businesses that are cropping up in the private sector, amongst students who want to pursue academic programs and careers in environmental work and in climate science. And all of that is happening against a backdrop in philanthropy where we see nonprofit organizations and philanthropic organizations that are encountering an increasingly aggressive federal government who are pursuing those organizations as, in some cases, terrorist organizations, largely because it runs counter to what is now the federal agenda. And so that fact, combined with what is now a very different financial picture for a lot of nonprofits, has meant that climate philanthropy is really doubling down on focusing on supporting and sustaining the many grantees that we currently have so that those organizations are able to continue to exist. And that has meant a more limited grant making environment in terms of new grant making that is happening. So we're trying to be proactive in terms of continuing to support existing work, not able to be as proactive in terms of cultivating new work, but really trying to make sure that all of the key players are trying to work together in a moment where it feels like there's not a lot of opportunity. So I guess that's what I would offer by way of background.
Great. Thanks, Londa. It's important to understand both text, the climate context, and especially when there's these competing pressures, how philanthropy thinks about it, and be good to dig into our conversation with the group about how collective action, maybe even among philanthropies, could be something that is maybe a new model that we would want to explore. President Washington, I wanted to get your comments from a presidential perspective on where you see the challenges and opportunities in this moment.
Well, I'd like to kind of continue on your theme of trust. I think we are in higher ed in general, but specific to this issue, we are dealing with a significant challenge relative to trust. And without trust, you can't effectively partner, right? If I think about the four rules of partnerships, they involve having similar goals, have each entity being necessary to achieve that goal. You must be willing to win or lose together. And the most important piece of building a partnership is that you have to trust one another. And we run a trust deficit right now. And so we've been trying to build upon mechanisms to help us get around that. And part of the way that I believe we can find a solution path forward is by meeting the climate challenge where it is. And the reality is we have to get back to resilience, right? Uh, as Londe basically stated, uh, we're going to overshoot the 1.5 degree target. We technically already have, and uh, the reality is we're going to see the net effect of extreme climate events. And so instead of talking about what is the cause, who is at fault, the focus for higher ed should be helping to build resilient societies, helping to build entities that can withstand what we know is coming. Uh, we had 14 uh, separate extreme weather events in the first 6 months of 2025, each in excess of $1 billion, leading to a total of 101 billion. If you start coming up with solutions to help communities move past that, that puts you in a different position, a less adversarial position, right? Because all communities, when you're ravaged by the outcomes of a climate related disaster, you want relief. And if we can be a big part of that, we can be a big part of rebuilding that trust that is necessary. Um, Look, at George Mason, we've put together uh, what we're calling our Grand Challenge Initiative. And as there's 6 different areas of investment. One of those 6 areas is building a climate resilient society. We've allocated about $15 million of campus money that will be matched by other entities, but we put campus money into this. And it's really about positioning our faculty, providing resources to position our faculty to develop teams, to do the groundwork necessary uh, to solve problems in this space, to present solutions so that they can go out and be effective warriors for this space outside of our shores, or so that they can go out and find avenues for funding support in the space. Um, we're applying science, policy, and innovation to help communities get past some of the challenges they're enduring, but also putting in place policies and systems to safeguard communities and ecosystems so that they are prepared for the next disaster that comes. So we look at what's happening as a foregone conclusion. We are going to have outcomes that are not positive for the country. Uh, Someone has to be about solving and preparing and helping and building up resiliency in communities because these communities have to recover on the back end of that. And so I can go on and talk about this for some time, but the idea here is really to start setting up frameworks to actually deal with the problem we have coming and use that to build a corresponding partnership with communities that'll let us put in place mechanisms to resist it in the future.
Great. You brought up a few things there. One, this idea of the trust deficit. We don't overcome that by rhetoric. We overcome that probably by doing things that build trust with people. So the idea of a resilient society, a resilient community, people have to feel that. People have to understand that. People have to get their needs met in ways that maybe higher education's been a little derelict in providing. We've been too ivory tower focused. So I'd love, Bob, for you to kind of bring your take to this on the ways in which some people just perceive higher education, especially the faculty. You're a faculty member. The perception could be, oh, you guys all you do is publish papers. That's all you care about. But in fact, that's not necessarily true. So we'd love to hear kind of the ways in which you see this applied work or even opportunities for the applied work around climate to be more effectively mobilized.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. So I come to this topic as a climate scientist and as a climate policy scholar, but also somebody who dealt with this topic some on the administrative side. Some years ago, while serving as the director of Rutgers Institute of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, I led the process to develop Rutgers' first climate action plan and subsequently served as founding co-director of our system-wide Office of Climate Action. Has in that role. And then subsequently, I was part of a group that 2 years ago worked with the National Science Foundation and the Office of Science and Technology Policy to convene a national summit and workshop on campus and community scale climate change solutions. And I also served as the first author of a recent perspective written by many of the organizers of that workshop. And in response to question we got, I put a link to that in the chat. Now, as we all know, higher ed institutions have great collective capacity to address major societal challenges. We saw that with COVID very recently, and it's also true of climate change. And calls for higher ed to address climate change are not new. They're the raison d'etre of organizations like TIMS. Nearly 20 years ago, what ultimately became 284 signatories of university signed on to the American College and University President's Climate Commitment to model ways to minimize global warming emissions and provide the knowledge and educated graduates to achieve climate neutrality. But what we've seen is that there are many different parts of the pieces, and what has been missing to some extent is synergy among the different roles higher ed plays with respect to the climate crisis. So in our work at the workshop and subsequently, we identified the three main societal roles, which are analogous to the tripartite mission of the research university and to the tripartite unit mission of the land grant system. Right. One is workforce development. Right. We need to ensure the workforce exists to execute the energy transition and to build resilience. And again, when I say we need to, there are programs already in place that are seeds of this, and we talk about that in the paper. And when we talk about workforce development, this really is a all sector activity from two-year institutions, training electricians, HVAC specialists, and building inspectors, to graduate programs developing engineers, scientists, doctors, lawyers, business people with climate expertise, to non-degree programs that bring eager college graduates or skilled postdoctoral experts to match community needs. There are examples of all of those around the country that can serve as models. Second, of course, higher ed drives the research and innovation to advance climate understanding and to develop climate solutions from earth system science through the engineering and social science needed for decarbonization and resilience. And third, dear to my heart, is a community engagement that leverages higher ed's role as publicly engaged anchor institutions. And this is true regardless of whether we're talking about public or private institutions. They almost all are anchors in some form, hubs in their local or regional economies, working with local government, civic organizations, and industry. For example, many public and land grant institutions have, over the past, in some cases, 30 years, often in partnership with the federal government or their states, built climate service programs that have worked and are working to actively help communities and governments make climate-informed decisions. Of course, the federal part of funding for that is a little unstable at the moment. Now, all three of these elements build on a platform of institutional operations, which again that's the core of that decarbonization and resilient bit on campus, but it's also something that can provide living labs for training and for technology development and demonstration. Um, well, we also highlighted some important recommendations, just one of which I want to talk about now is the importance of supporting engaged scholarship on a platform of effective, respectful, trusting, to use the term that we've used here, sustained community relations, right? In the land grant model, that is embedded in people, extension specialists and extension agents who actually have careers who are not funded grant to grant, but really are why land grant universities are able to build deep, long-lasting ties to the communities. And I don't think we can achieve our goal without that sort of investment. Stepping back one more level in this year, I would argue that we can't do climate resilience without democratic resilience. And that means as a higher ed climate action community, we need to be focused on what for much of recent history was viewed as a core of higher ed's missions, educating human beings, not just to be economic actors, but to be citizens. Has Liberty Hyde Bailey, the founding dean of the New York State College of Agriculture at Cornell, one of the pioneers of land grant, said higher ed has to advance real democratic expression on the part of the people. And as Clarence Smith and Meredith Chester wrote in a 1930 review of cooperative extension, one of the strengths higher ed can lean into and has at times through its history is bringing people together for social intercourse, to solve community and neighborhood problems, to foster better relations and common endeavor between town and country, and to develop in cooperation and enriching life and broadening the vision of the people. So while I think all the roles we identify for the climate crisis in particular is critical, we also have to think throughout this about how that relates to our roles as institutions in deepening democracy.
Great. Hadn't thought about social intercourse before, but maybe that's something we come back to in a future webinar. I want to open the four of us together. Can we put all of us together? So, because I want to have a conversation now. We have talked, you three have introduced a variety of themes, and I think I'd want to pull on a little bit of the recent history to start us off. And that is, would love to hear, and let's discuss a little bit about the effects the past 12 months have had on higher education's leadership. And by that, I mean, we had an event in DC right after the inauguration, and there was real struggles around what sort of framing and language we should be using to do this work. And President Washington, I know you participated in that. It was quite a time, but all of you have brought up a little bit of this language and framing, like what does it mean to be a resilient campus? Can you have democratic resilience and climate resilience? What's the relationship between those two? And how does philanthropy connect with the social framing that we might have? So I guess I'd wonder, my first question would be, is in these past 12 months, is there a change in the narrative that either we've lost, we need to pick back up, or that we need to create around higher education's climate role? And have you seen that work somewhere? Have you seen that framing work? Has it been successful in certain places, not successful in other places? What are you sensing right now around the narrative frame and the narrative shifts from the past 12 months? President Washington, I'll start with you, and then we can ping pong it around. That's
Uh, for lack of a better way of saying this, we've totally lost the narrative. Uh, we've and this is not going to sound positive on my fellow presidents, but we lost the narrative, and many of us have lost the courage
mm,
to speak uh, uh, in reaction to those who actually control or are trying to control the narrative, and it's it's a problem.
mm.
We have to have a serious national conversation on these issues. And that is done by both sides highlighting in very clear terms what the issues are, what some of the solutions are, and quite frankly, what some of the impediments are. And when the impediments are government, when the impediments are policies, when the impediments are structural frameworks that have been put in place to keep those faculty and staff and students from effectively prosecuting solutions that could bring about meaningful change, those of us who can have to have the courage call out those actions, and to call out those actions as being negative actions on moving an effort forward. And so there is a narrative piece that we've lost, and there's a courage piece that we have to gain.
And you've stepped into that. It seems like of all the leaders, you maybe even iconically have stepped into that. And I've wondered what little things could somebody be encouraged to do if you were to talk to a fellow president in another state or another area and say, here's the lesson that I took away from these past 12 months on what courage and leadership and narrative look like that we've lost. What is there not to be afraid of, or what is there maybe the fear of that you were able to overcome in your role?
Oh, well, let's be clear. Uh, there's a lot to be afraid of. You will be attacked. You will be mocked. Um, but many of us come from a lineage, a history where people have given up their livelihood and their lives in order to reach a greater purpose and goal. Uh, this is an entity that's worthy of our dedication and pursuit, because uh, when we get it wrong, there is significant loss of life. We're seeing that. We're literally experiencing that in the country. And so uh, I can't give you a bona fide answer as to uh, why people aren't doing well. I can give you a partial answer, but why people aren't doing what they need to do, because you know I engage my colleagues and others. People know the right path to take but it's hard. There's just no other way to put it. And uh, people don't want to be made an example of, right? And so that being said, we can't make progress if there aren't those that sacrifice, right? And then aren't those that support those that sacrifice, right? Part of being in leadership on this day and in this time is speaking truth to power so that you can provide a pathway for your faculty to feel free and go out and do the work that needs to be done, right? And when their grants are being canceled and removed just because of special wording that they have in those grants, we have to call that out, right?
It's really meaningful. Bob, maybe you could pick up on this as a faculty member to have a presidential leader who, is there for you. And not many people are sticking their neck out like President Washington. So,
Yeah.
kudos to President Bob. Any relationship with your president or thinking about that relationship from faculty and administration?
Yeah, I mean, so of course we have a new president at Rutgers. I think is still getting oriented to him. Uh, but I should say from a faculty perspective, I say I run a 13 institution consortium. We had our annual meeting in May. And we had our wonderful senior vice president for government relations, Francine Pfeiffer, who you know well, Tim, come and speak to all members of our consortium. And we had some students from other universities, including one prominent one in New York City, say, "Oh my God, we've never heard us leadership have just a frank discussion with us about what's going on our campus and what the federal government is doing to our campus." And that's really important, right? We talk about trust. Well, that trust from the students, not that the administration doesn't pretend as though nothing is going on. Like that's really important. I mean, the other thing I say that has a faculty, I at Rutgers, we are a unionized campus. I am a member of AAUP, AFT, and AAUP has played a critical role in fighting for things that perhaps administration should be fighting for. And I think our administration has been, but you just saw the victory at the University of California to defend some of the grants there that came from an AAUP lawsuit, not an institutional lawsuit. Um, and we're also saying as a climate scientist, the American Geophysical Union has also been very, very active, including in litigation. And so I think like that community at all scales is really important, right? Building, as universities, we need to be investing in building the sort of relationships that build trust, which I think historically land grants have often done quite well, not always, but it's been really been part of a mission that, maybe more ivory towers have institutions haven't always filled. But I also think like the communities that faculty and students and administrators can be part of are essential to the democratic resilience part.
Mhm. And maybe that you bring up some things here, maybe not the common players within the unit, like how many people on faculty have actually engaged with their government relations people, like maybe a small percentage, how many actually have reached out to their association of whatever, fill in the blank, thinking that they could actually lead litigation or legal action. I know ACE's helped support that as well. So this is kind of a new all-in kind of moments, I think it seems like for the sector that we would continue to pursue and maybe rely on people, reach out to people who would be in roles that you normally wouldn't be the normal folks. Lonnie, I guess I'm curious from your perspective on philanthropic leadership, which also probably experiences a little bit of this, who's going to step up, who's going to step in. What does it look like for you to lead a coalition? How many people are putting their head down, hunkering down? What does that look like from your perspective these past 6 months, and then maybe moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are a couple things I would say is in terms of your first question about higher education, I don't think you can divorce higher education climate leadership from higher education leadership.
Mm.
And the truth is, we spent the first 6 months of this year with higher education leadership taking cover,
Mhm.
to Mr. Washington's point, and not being courageous. And we saw a federal government that was exceedingly effective at picking off institution by institution because people would not come together.
Mm.
And it's only recently in the last 6 weeks, 2 months, that it feels like the higher education sector has begun to think about how do we come together to have a unified response against what feel like very pointed attacks at the higher education sector. And only when you start to do that and begin to provide that kind of breadth of courage, can you then get to the issues that sit beneath that? So, yes, there's a reason why higher education climate leadership has not been prevalent, because higher education leadership has not been able to be prevalent in the last year. So I think there's actually, I'm encouraged by what we've seen in the last 6 to 8 weeks, with people thinking that they don't necessarily have to sign a compact, and that they're willing to be courageous and think about what it is we want to do collectively rather than what I need to do individually for my institution. So I think that's a really important basis. Similarly, I would say, sitting in philanthropy, we watched what happened with the law firms. We watched what happened with the higher education institutions, and we decided we were not going to go that route. And we knew that we were going to be the subject of scrutiny. And so you saw or philanthropic organizations across the board come together and do actually what is not often done in the climate and environmental sector, because one thing that the climate change activists and climate change folks are really bad about is acknowledging that there are other issues that matter to people.
Mm-hmm.
And so they put their issue first. They don't show up as allies. And what in fact happens is then when they need people to come to come to the rescue, no one wants to show up because you've never shown up for me. Right. And so actually what you saw with philanthropy is philanthropy deciding to break down those silos, deciding whether I care about immigration or I care about the economy or I care about climate. We're going to come together and figure out what we need to do as a sector to be prepared for when that scrutiny came our way. And so there were, I don't even know how many hundreds of signatories that signed on to something that said, we are actually standing together. So you have seen philanthropy begin to take that role with great respect to John Palfrey at the MacArthur Foundation and Tanya at the McKnight Foundation. Like, people have come together and have organized. And I think that is a really, really promising um, action, because it is now allowing there to be more space for some of the sub issues, like thinking about climate and immigration and all of those things, to begin to continue to have strategies that are advanced. So that's what I would say about kind of the philanthropic sector. And as I said before, right now philanthropy is really focused on the fact that a lot of federal funding has been pulled from a lot of our grantee partners, and we're trying to figure out how do we stabilize and sustain those organizations. That's really been the first priority.
So that's an interesting take. So the idea of sector unification before topical unification within the sector, maybe a lesson there for higher education to think about. As this, it definitely seemed like with that compact, like the hard line was academic freedom or some level of free academic expression that kind of like at least the top people were unwilling to compromise on. I would wonder, President Washington, your thoughts on this idea of like, is there a unification moment that stands above something specific to climate first, or are these things in parallel? Or when you talk to your presidential colleagues, or is this even on the radar? Is it survival mode at this point? Like, what are you thinking and hearing as we think about kind of the future issues?
Well, I think there is a resistance point that has been reached, as Londe highlighted. Um, I actually don't know if that point will go into, for lack of a better way of saying it, will reach down far enough into the climate resilience and climate change issues that we needed to in order to resist at that level.
Why do you think that might not happen?
Well, okay, so at a very, very high level, if you go back to some of the early teachings of people like Frederick Douglass, right, who said, find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them.
Mm.
And these will continue until they are resisted with either words or blows or both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. And so the idea here is you push and people say they don't do anything, and then you push a little further, and then they don't do anything, and then you push a little further, and then they don't do anything, and then you push to the point where you actually do get resistance. And then the question is, how much of that can you peel, and how much can you peel back, right? Because you don't snap back all of it, right? The issue is how much ground have we lost in this cascading series of concessions that
Mm.
we've made to the government up to this point? Because we
Hmm.
have lost ground.
Hmm.
Make no mistake about it, right?
Hmm.
And so, and those are things that we're going to have to collectively as a, and this is what I mean when I say we have to have a serious conversation about this issue from a very, very high level. And we have to decide what specific entities, what specific items we are going to fight for, right? Look, a fundamental decision just has to be made. And when we decide what we will fight for, then we can determine how to fight. But
Hmm.
we don't yet know the what. Individuals might be able to make that stance, but this is not an individual fight. This is a collective community fight, and it requires. And I know the things that I am saying are hard, but they are truth, right? And I don't know how we get past this without a collective resistance to the kinds of things we know are detrimental to our society. Ultimately, that's what I care about, right? I got two young children. Well, they're not that young anymore, but they're 20s, they're in their early 20s, right? And I want them to be able to have a society to live in that's akin to what I had growing up and what my parents had growing up, right? And so I'm willing to sacrifice for them to ensure that there has to be enough people who fundamentally believe that you're willing to risk what you have so that you can ensure that they have a, as bright a future, as many opportunities, right? And that they're not stifled with trying to solve every major climate catastrophe happening to them on a literally a weekly basis, right? That's really what we're trying to get at here, right? And so uh, there is a collective come to Jesus moment that has to happen, and I don't think that's happened yet. And once that happens, we'll get our footing, right? Collectively, there'll be enough people to get their footing around the specific issues, and then we'll begin to mount a specific set of challenges towards dealing with those issues.
I guess I'm curious about this idea of there needs to be a collective reckoning and how that happens. Because you could imagine it happens at a high level, at a national level, by groups like ACE, maybe Second Nature, convening people to, come to whatever Jesuses they want to come to. That's a little bit different than in Virginia and in New Jersey and in California. There's a series of these things happening that we are not actually sensing or picking up on because we're not paying close enough attention to the local communities. And there was a comment in one of the questions about, is that scale, is that kind of city scale the one maybe that we should be focused on? Or is there a version of that, of this kind of not, we bring everybody together at the high level and then that trickles down versus we're disaggregated across the country. We sense that happening and we pick up on these little nodes, maybe big nodes of activity where the resistance is manifesting. And if we can do that, then we aggregate that activity together. We get to this, Jesus's moment, whatever the deity you want to impose there. I guess, Bob, you've thought a lot about this. Like, what does it look like for scale to happen? And like there are extension offices across every state in the country, and there are different conversations going on at some level, probably at most institutions, if not most regions. So what does it look like maybe to either go top down or like a little more grassroots?
Yeah, I mean, so that's, let me think back 5 years to when we were proposing like a bold vision that would have federal support. I say like we would argue like if you wanted to fully mobilize higher ed in a more supportive societal climate for climate action at the community level, well, what would you need? Well, yeah, I argued, well, you need to support those community campus relations at the scale of cooperative extension, right? Cooperative extension, not using cooperative extension because cooperative extension folks already have a full-time job. But the analog of investing in a system where there is, somebody for every congressional district basically who is the bridge between communities and the campus. Like that's the scale of cooperative extension, and that's sort of the scale if you were to envision a system that centered community engagement, right? You would need things like tenure track jobs at universities for people whose goal is to ensure that there are good relations between community organizations and campus, and that research and teaching integrate community needs. Now, there's not $1.5 billion a year just for climate extension, in the offering anytime soon. Uh, but I do think, in the course of this larger reckoning, um, of what we are doing as a sector, there are things like, well, we throw a lot of stumbling blocks in our own right way when it comes to building relationships with communities. And there are lessons from the extension experience that are relevant. Like, well, how do we incentivize faculty and have more faculty who view community engagement as a core part of their activities? How do we make sure that working to address community needs has a similar role in promotion and tenure criteria to getting a paper in Nature. And like some of those are things, we can be working on even without the funding to hire those additional faculty who would really be forward to that. Like, and that was something we were working on. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily get at this, on its own at this broader question of trust, if it's climate focused, but in fact, if we go beyond that and say like we're really how do we make sure we have enough people and we incentivize co-production and research and teaching that engages communities broadly, that I think that could help do a lot to rebuild trust. How
Yeah.
you, but that is a longer term investment. It's not a we're under attack now and investment necessarily, but it's something to do in the course of envision. We don't want to be defending attack. We want to know what it is we are trying to grow back to, because it's not going to be the same thing as we fell back from.
Right. So there's a forward-looking fall. That's where we want to go. And there might be some of these structural changes that now could be a time to lay the infrastructure, maybe when resources might be a little bit difficult. I'm also thinking on the philanthropic side, we did a little bit of a workshop a few years ago about this, where in coastal Georgia, there was a grant that was given for stormwater management, and the researcher had an idea of what that looked like. They thought it was tree planting. The community said, well, we don't want any trees. And the researcher's like, oh, shoot, that screws up my grant. Because my grant said I needed to plant X number of trees and I had funding for that. But they listened to the community, and the community said, we would love a community garden. That would be amazing. And the research was like, okay, well, let's see what kind of stormwater management that actually works too. So instead of planting X number of trees, they installed X number of community gardens. And what that did with the funder who was flexible on it, who didn't say, well, it's trees or bust. Now all of a sudden you built this relationship, you built trust with those communities because you actually listened to what they had to
Yeah.
say. And I
And
guess Londa, yeah,
if you had the right investment and extension type infrastructure ahead of time, you would have known that at the grant writing phase, right? We wouldn't have to be figuring that because you would already know the communities and would be working with them in the process of figuring out what
Yeah,
to
this
do.
is interesting. It was marine extension, so I'm not sure where the breakdown was. So it could have been a
Yeah.
Georgia forestry grant through marine extension. The point being that I would wonder, Lande, how philanthropy can be flexible during these times to encourage maybe some of the learning that, on the surface may be like, oh, this is just how we do things. This is just what we fund. This is how we fund it. This is the KPIs that we need to see. And the communities that are receiving it are like, wait a second, this is like hugely disruptive. We need to learn as we go. How do you approach that on the philanthropic side? Have you started to see creative, grant making that is flexible with the communities, or do you guys operate that way generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two issues here. I've always said if you know and have seen one foundation, you've seen exactly one foundation. Foundations are all very unique, very bespoke, and part of it is because they're like higher education institutions, insofar as they each have their own unique boards, with each having their own unique priorities. So it becomes difficult to compare from institution to institution. That said, as a sector, one of the things that has been much talked about within the philanthropic community for a long time, and for some reason, a lot of foundations still aren't there, is about general operating support.
Mm,
And so, if you are able to structure your grants in a way that offers general operating support, which is a component of trust-based philanthropy, and the term trust-based philanthropy, I think, is often misunderstood, and people think, oh, trust-based philanthropy means I don't ask my grantees anything, I don't require anything. It's never going to be that, probably, because you do have boards who care about some of those outcomes. But it does mean that you're giving support to an organization and trusting them to be able to allocate those resources and think about, given the outcomes that we know we share, that we have in common, how are they going to get there? And then you do get to your example, Tim, where you might move from planting trees to something to a community garden because
mhm,
you're looking at the outcomes together. You're not
mhm,
dictating the activities, right?
mhm,
And you're going
mhm.
to trust the people who are stewarding those resources to actually figure out how do we get to those shared outcomes. So I think
Yeah.
that is, from a philanthropic perspective, where increasingly the field talks about going, and we just need to continue to move there and move there much more rapidly.
Mm, great. I want to address one question, or just have you all address actually with the one question in the chat here. I'm just going to read it verbatim. Um, Someone says, I'm going into my fourth year of work in higher education. I'm 29 years old. I've never experienced a higher education institution that was not extremely resource constrained. That's kind of a common narrative too. And Trump has been president more than any other actor during my adult life. Can you hear what resistance and success in higher ed looks like when it is successful? I don't have any examples top of mind. So let's just make this kind of a closing comment
Yeah.
because I do think there is a little bit of like, what does what do we want to see in the future? And at times like this, it can feel hopeless. Like I don't see a future for our sector, for the climate work that I'm really committed to doing. But what actually might success look like in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years from where you sit right now? How do you think about that? Who wants to go first? I put President Washington on the spot before, so maybe either Bob or Londe.
I would love to hear what President Washington has to say, but I guess I will offer a couple of thoughts. And the answer is like, I my work is core research is on sort of climate risk, and we have this concept of deep uncertainty where you don't know how to assess the likelihood of different outcomes or what's happening. And I feel like that's the world we're in right now. And when you have deep uncertainty, well, we should do some scenario exploration, and maybe that would be a good
Mm,
activity, Tim, for Second Nature to help facilitate. But also we have to just think what we can do given where we are right now. And so that's when I give talks about the state of climate science, I often say, as I said in my remarks, well, one thing we can do is build up those intermediary organizations like our faculty unions, like our professional societies, if they're showing backbone. that are the way in which we as individuals, faculty members or individual postdocs or whatever, can influence the world. Like the building of those collective institutions is really important. And I think that's like in the 1 year time frame. I think that's where I would go. And I think we'll have to see where we are in 10 years, but it would be nice to have some roadmaps developed of alternative possible futures.
Great. President Washington, you want to go?
So we will see. Let me back up for a minute. I am actually encouraged by what I see, uh, for lack of a better way of calling it, green shoots happening all over the country in terms of people really starting to stand up in a whole host of areas and resist directions that they think are detrimental to themselves and to society. And uh, so I, to me, when you are getting the right thing, when you see people standing strongly in mass on their values, right? Standing on belief and standing on their values. And look, external input, external stress, conditions don't change values if they're truly your values. And when you see people stand on those, that represents a positive movement. You may not have the right outcome that you want to have right now, but that represents real progress. And so when you start to see that at mass, we're starting to move in the right direction.
Great.
I think you're starting to see that in some states, right?
Mhm.
And because you're seeing that, you're starting to see outcomes happen in those places. And so I'm actually quite encouraged by that. And I think you're going to see more of it, even when there is some level of failure. Look, uh, I do believe that the arc of justice bends towards righteousness at some point. It could take us a little bit of time to get there, but we will indeed get there. And so I assume that that's a young person who asked that question, and I would tell them uh, to get an understanding of what's happening around you in your environment, understand what's happening in our environment, understand what's happening in our climate, right? Understand those solutions that are out there to fix it, and then develop a value system around that and stand on those values. And that represents positive change and positive outcomes. And
That's
that will
great.
lead to the kind of thing we want to see in the long term.
Londa, you want to close us out?
Sure. I guess I would say, the environmental sector, the climate change sector have a real problem. And it's that we assume that the nature of this crisis, this existential crisis by itself, is enough to compel people toward action. And I think higher ed has a role to play by helping this next generation of environmentalists to understand that the interdisciplinary nature of their work, that you can't care about 1.5 degrees without also caring about the health and well-being of communities, right? From the perspective of those communities, right? Not because you're planting trees, but because the communities want to plant those gardens.
Mhm.
So what that means is when a mother tells you that her most pressing problem is that her child has asthma, we're going to solve her asthma problem first, and then back into the fact that that problem is caused by air pollution, which is caused by fossil fuels, rather than asking that person to go and change their carbon footprint.
Mhm. Mhm.
Folks in the climate field are not well known for being good allies. They're not well known for figuring out how to address a range of social problems like health, like education, like employment. And the more we teach our students to see these problems as interconnected, as linked, the greater the impact will be that we will have in addressing them.
That's great. That's a
Tim,
great,
that's a closeout, buddy.
yeah, that's that's a note to end on. I think we did just want to really, first of all, thank you all for your insight in kicking off this series. We wanted to have a high level perspective first. This is a series, so we're going to have a few more sessions over the next few months to dig into some of these topics further. Appreciate the audience sticking with us. We're a minute over. I think we were, Andre, going to put up just a couple slides with those events coming up. One of which is the Higher Ed Climate Leadership Summit, which is taking place in Chicago, where we are able to go deep. We're in person, physically together, where we can talk deeply about some of these issues. And then also, there's the ACE meeting, Marisol. I think you were going to mention this. If you're, yep, still around.
I am.
Great.
So our ACE experience, you can see the QR code. Please sign up and we'll be engaging there as well.
Thanks, everybody, for all your time. Thanks, everybody, for your thoughts. And let's keep up the good work and keep the hope alive. Thanks.